Stabbed 5 times by the Apache woman, he woke up to 3 Apache watching him. John had been traveling alone for days, his horse long gone after an accident with a hidden rock, leaving him to rely on his own 2 feet. Every step he took kicked up small clouds of sand, and every sound in the desert, whether a distant coyote's howl or the whisper of the wind through the canyons, made him alert and cautious. He had learned long ago that the desert could be as beautiful as it was dangerous. John carried a small pack with only the essentials: a knife, some dried meat, a water skin, and a few other supplies. He was a man who had learned to survive in the wilderness, but this journey was different. He was searching for a route across the canyon that would lead him to a small settlement rumored to exist beyond the desert hills. He had heard stories of the people living there, tales of opportunity, but also warnings about the lands he had to cross. Still, he pressed on. Every step felt heavier as fatigue set in, his body screaming for rest even as his mind pushed him forward. As evening fell, he finally reached a rocky area that seemed like a safe place to camp. The rocks formed natural walls around a small flat space, offering some protection from the wind and a place to start a fire. John knelt on the ground and began gathering dry sticks and brush. Sparks from flint and steel finally ignited a small flame, and soon he had a fire crackling gently before him. He sat down, feeling a momentary relief, and pulled out his dried meat. The simple meal tasted better than anything he had eaten in days. The desert, however, was never truly silent. As the sun dipped lower, he noticed movement among the rocks. A shadow flickered, too swift and deliberate to be an animal. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt. Heart pounding, he stood slowly, trying to make himself as calm and non-threatening as possible. The shadow moved again, closer this time, and he realized he was being watched. Before he could react, a figure emerged from the rocks. It was a woman, her movements fast and precise, her eyes sharp and focused. She held a knife in her hand, and her expression was fierce, unyielding. John barely had time to comprehend what was happening. One moment he was trying to stay calm, and the next, the woman lunged at him with incredible speed. His knife met hers in a clash that rang through the quiet desert. The fight was brief but intense. John struggled to defend himself, but the woman was skilled, moving with a fluidity and strength he had not expected. Her knife found him again and again, piercing his side. Pain exploded through his body, sharp and blinding, and he fell to the ground, gasping for air. Blood soaked his clothing and the sand beneath him, and darkness began to creep into his vision. The woman's eyes met his for a brief second. There was no anger, no hatred, just a wild, determined intensity. Then she vanished into the rocks as quickly as she had appeared, leaving John alone and wounded. Lying on the ground, John's mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. He tried to move, but the pain was overwhelming, each breath a struggle. He pressed his hand to his side, feeling the warmth of his own blood, and realized he might not survive the night. The desert around him, once so familiar, now felt alien and threatening. Every sound, the crackle of his dying fire, the distant call of a bird, the whisper of the wind, was amplified in his fear. But John was not a man who gave up easily. He had survived harsh winters, treacherous rivers, and wild animals, and he refused to let this wound end his life. Slowly, with great effort, he tried to crawl toward a small depression among the rocks, hoping it would provide some shelter. His body screamed in protest, but he kept moving, determined to find a position where he could rest, even if only for a little while. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. The night grew colder, and the fire he had started finally died, leaving him in near darkness. John shivered, wrapping his arms around himself as best he could. Thoughts of his family, friends, and the life he had left behind filled his mind. He thought of the stories he had heard of travelers who had disappeared in these lands, and he realized he had narrowly joined their ranks. Yet, amidst the fear and pain, there was a small spark of hope. He had survived worse, and maybe, just maybe, he could survive this too. The desert night was silent except for the occasional rustle of animals moving in the shadows. John's eyes slowly closed, exhaustion overtaking him, but his mind remained alert. He could still feel the sting of his wounds, the ache in his muscles, and the sharp awareness that he was alone and vulnerable. Sleep came in fits, broken by pain and the constant sense of danger. Yet in those brief moments, he dreamed of life beyond the desert, of green fields, flowing water, and warmth. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, John's consciousness returned more fully. The desert transformed with the rising sun, revealing the colors and textures hidden in the darkness. He opened his eyes slowly, squinting against the brightness. It was then that he realized he was not alone. Figures moved in the distance, 3 shapes sitting and watching him with a stillness that made his heart race. The pain in his side was almost secondary now to the fear and confusion that gripped him. Who were these people? Were they friends, foes, or something in between? He could not tell. Their faces were calm but unreadable, and their eyes seemed to pierce into his very soul. John's mind raced, trying to understand the situation. The woman who had attacked him, was she among them? Were they allies or enemies? He remained still, refusing to make a move that could provoke them. Each breath was careful, measured, as he tried to convey peace without words. Time seemed to stretch. The 3 figures did not move, only observing him. John realized that he had no choice but to stay calm and show no sign of threat. Any sudden motion, any wrong glance could cost him his life. Yet, amidst the fear, there was a strange sense of awe. These people were part of this land, connected to it in a way he could not understand. He had entered their world uninvited, and now he was at their mercy. The desert was no longer just a place of survival. It was a place of lessons, of tests, and of unexpected encounters. John had learned that courage alone was not enough. Awareness, respect, and patience were equally vital. As he lay there, wounded and watched, he began to understand that his story was far from over. The desert had challenged him, tested him, and now it was giving him another chance, if he could only navigate the trust and fear that lay before him. With the rising sun casting long shadows across the rocks, John prepared himself mentally for whatever would come next. He did not yet know whether he would survive this encounter or what lessons he would take from it. But he knew one thing: he was alive against all odds, and the desert had not yet claimed him. The struggle, the pain, and the fear had all led to this moment. A moment that would define not only his survival, but his understanding of the land and the people who called it home. The first rays of the sun stretched across the desert, lighting up the rugged rocks and casting long shadows over the sandy ground. John's head throbbed with pain, and his side felt raw and hot where the knife had cut him the day before. Each breath was a reminder of how close he had come to death. Yet, miraculously, he was alive. Slowly, he tried to sit up, testing the strength in his arms and legs. The desert around him was quiet, almost eerily so, but his attention was fixed on the 3 figures sitting a short distance away. He could see them clearly now in the morning light. They were Apache, their posture calm but alert. Their eyes were fixed on him, studying him like one studies a strange animal in the wild. John's mind raced. He had survived attacks from wild animals, sudden storms, and even hostile strangers, but this, being watched by people who could decide his fate with a single movement, felt different. Fear mixed with curiosity. Who were they? What did they want? And most importantly, why hadn't they left or attacked him when he was clearly weak and defenseless? John's body hurt with every movement, but he forced himself to remain calm. He did not want to provoke them with sudden gestures. Slowly he raised his hands, showing he carried no weapon. The 3 Apaches shifted slightly, their eyes never leaving him. They whispered among themselves in their own language, their voices low and measured. John could not understand the words, but he could sense the rhythm of caution in their tone. Something told him they were not immediately hostile. They were watching, assessing, trying to understand him, just as he was trying to understand them. Hours passed in a tense silence. The sun climbed higher and the desert grew warmer. John's wounds burned, and dehydration threatened to make him dizzy, but he dared not move too far or too quickly. He remembered the herbs he had once used to treat minor cuts and burns, and he began to tear small pieces of cloth from his shirt to apply pressure to his wounds. Each movement was painful, but he gritted his teeth and focused on the task. The pain was sharp, yet it reminded him that he was alive and had a chance to survive this ordeal. The three Apache did not leave. They remained at a distance, but occasionally one would rise and move slightly closer, always maintaining a careful observation. John noticed that they carried no visible weapons aimed at him. That small detail gave him hope. Perhaps the woman who had attacked him, the one whose knife had found his side 5 times, was among them. Perhaps she had struck him not out of hatred but as a warning, a way to test his strength or courage. He could not be sure, but the thought gave him a strange, uneasy comfort. As the morning turned into midday, John realized he had to act carefully if he wanted to survive. He tried speaking softly, hoping they might understand a few English words, but they remained silent, only tilting their heads as if listening and watching. He began to use gestures, pointing to his wounds, then to himself, then to the sun to indicate he was exhausted and needed help. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, one of the Apache stood and moved closer. John froze, not wanting to startle them. The figure stopped a few meters away and crouched, keeping his eyes on John. John noticed something surprising. The Apache's expression was not cruel or angry. It was calm, almost thoughtful. He realized that they were not here to harm him further. Perhaps they were curious about this lone traveler who had survived the night after being attacked. Perhaps they were assessing whether he could be trusted. Every instinct John had screamed that this was a delicate situation. A single wrong move could end his life, but a careful display of trust and respect might earn him a chance to live. Over the next few hours, John carefully moved closer to the rocks, trying to find a small shadow where he could rest and shield himself from the sun. Each step was measured, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. The Apache watched silently, never making a threatening move, but their eyes never left him. It was exhausting just to be observed so closely, but John forced himself to remain calm. He reminded himself of the lessons he had learned in the wilderness. Patience, respect, and observation could often mean the difference between life and death. By late morning, one of the Apache, an older man with a steady gaze, approached closer than the others. He carried a small bundle of herbs and roots. John's heart raced. He did not know what the man intended, but he kept still, showing no sudden movement. The man knelt a short distance away and laid the herbs carefully on the ground. Then slowly and deliberately, he pointed to John's wounds and made a motion with his hands that John could understand as apply. It was an offer of help. John hesitated. Could he trust them? After the pain of the attack, after the fear of the night, trust was not easy to give. But he also knew that without help, he might not survive the day. Carefully, he nodded, showing he understood. The man handed him the herbs, and with the other hand, he gestured for John to use them to treat his cuts. With trembling fingers, John applied the herbs to his wounds, feeling the sting but also a soothing coolness. He realized that the Apache were not just observing him, they were helping him survive. As the day wore on, John slowly regained some strength. The sun climbed high and then began to lower, casting the desert in golden light. He noticed small details about the Apache, the way they moved silently, the way they communicated without words, and the way they seemed deeply connected to the land around them. They were not just warriors, they were people of the desert, living in harmony with it in a way John had never fully understood. A sense of respect grew in him, mingled with awe and a touch of fear. Evening approached, and John realized he had to sleep soon, but he did not dare to close his eyes completely. The three Apache remained nearby, sitting quietly, alert as ever. He settled into a small shadow among the rocks, using the little strength he had left to adjust his position. His wounds throbbed, and exhaustion pulled at him, but he kept his mind alert, watching the figures around him. In those moments, he understood a truth he had never fully appreciated. Survival was never just about strength or courage. It was about observation, patience, and understanding the intentions of those around you. Night came again, but this time John did not feel as alone. The Apache had shown him mercy, had offered help, and had made it clear that he could not harm them without consequence, nor could they harm him without reason. He realized that this encounter, terrifying as it had been, was also a lesson. Life in the wilderness was unpredictable, dangerous, and often brutal, but it was also full of unexpected opportunities, connections, and moments of mercy. As John drifted into a fitful sleep, he thought of the woman who had attacked him. He imagined her eyes, fierce yet not cruel, and wondered if she had been watching him even now. Perhaps her attack had been a test, a way to see if he was strong, smart, and careful enough to survive. Perhaps she had wanted him to understand the rules of the desert and the people who lived there. John did not know, but he felt a strange gratitude mixed with fear. He had survived the night, and now he had a chance to learn more, to understand, and maybe even to earn the trust of those who had saved him from death. Through the long, quiet night, John listened to the sounds of the desert, letting them lull him into a light, cautious sleep. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his courage, patience, and understanding. But he also knew that he had survived something extraordinary. He had faced death, been spared, and had begun to understand the complex, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying world of the Apache and the desert they called home. In that moment, lying under the vast desert sky, John realized that survival was not just about living. It was about learning, respecting, and connecting, even in the most unexpected and dangerous ways. He had been stabbed, he had bled, and he had been watched, but he was alive, and that life was now intertwined with a story far larger than himself. The morning sun broke over the horizon, spilling golden light across the rocky desert. John woke slowly, feeling the aches and pain in his body from the wounds that still burned in his side. The night had been long, filled with half-sleep and constant awareness of the three Apache figures who had watched him from the shadows. But now, with daylight, he could see them clearly. They were sitting a short distance away, calm and composed, their eyes fixed on him with careful attention. John knew he had survived the attack by the woman, but he still did not understand her intentions. He could see now that the woman had not been cruel. She had struck him with precision, not anger. He remembered her eyes, sharp, intense, and unwavering, yet not full of hatred. It was a strange mix of fear and respect that he felt toward her, the kind that comes from recognizing someone is both dangerous and wise. And now, as he looked at the three Apache, he realized that the woman may have been among them, her presence still a mystery. He slowly moved, testing his strength, careful not to make sudden movements that might alarm them. The pain in his side was constant, but it forced him to move cautiously, almost as if the wound itself was a teacher. He tried to communicate with gestures, pointing to his body, then to the sun, then to himself, showing that he was alive but weak, that he meant no harm, and that he needed understanding. One of the Apache, the older man, nodded slightly, as if recognizing John's intentions. Over the next hours, John realized something remarkable. The Apache were not merely observing him. They were studying him, trying to understand who he was and what kind of person he might be. Their calm demeanor and careful movements showed a discipline and intelligence that John had never encountered. These were not mindless warriors. They were people with rules, with principles, and with a deep connection to their land and their community. Every movement, every glance, every whispered word between them carried meaning that John could only guess at. John forced himself to remain calm. He knew that panic, fear, or rash movements could cost him his life. Instead, he focused on observation, trying to understand the signals the Apache were giving. The older man occasionally gestured toward John's wounds, pointing to the herbs they had given him the day before. He realized that they were offering guidance, teaching him how to survive and heal, but doing so on their own terms. John was learning a new kind of communication, one without words, based on observation, respect, and subtle gestures. By midday, John felt a small measure of strength returning. The pain in his side was still sharp, but the herbs had soothed the worst of the burns and cuts. He dared to shift slightly, stretching his legs and arms carefully. One of the younger Apache approached, carrying a small amount of water. John's heart leapt. He had been careful not to show desperation, but the simple act of offering water was a profound gesture of trust. He accepted it slowly, drinking with gratitude while making sure to maintain calm and respectful posture. The Apache's eyes watched him closely, yet there was no hint of hostility. As the sun climbed higher, John began to piece together more of what had happened. The woman who had attacked him had not acted out of cruelty or malice. She had acted to protect her people and her land. Her attack was a warning, a test, and a demonstration of the rules of the desert. John realized that he had intruded into their territory, and his presence alone could have been seen as a threat. Yet, instead of ending his life, she and the other Apache had chosen to watch, assess, and eventually aid him. It was a lesson in humility, one that John understood more deeply with every passing hour. The day passed slowly, filled with observation and cautious interaction. John tried speaking again, using simple words and gestures, pointing to his wounds and mimicking healing motions. The Apache responded with quiet gestures, showing him how to use the herbs effectively and pointing toward shaded areas where he could rest. Each interaction was a delicate dance, requiring patience, care, and mutual respect. John felt a growing sense of connection, an understanding that survival in this land was about more than strength or skill. It was about respect, trust, and careful observation. By late afternoon, John dared to move closer to the Apache. He did so slowly, keeping his hands visible and his posture relaxed. The older man did not move away, and the younger figures remained still but attentive. John realized that he was being cautiously accepted. This was not friendship, not yet, but it was recognition. He was no longer a simple intruder to be observed. He was a wounded traveler who had shown care, patience, and respect, and in return, they were willing to allow him into their circle in a limited way. John's mind wandered to the woman who had attacked him. He wondered if she had been testing his spirit, seeing if he could endure pain, fear, and uncertainty without panicking. Perhaps she had been watching him all night, ensuring that he could survive the desert and respect the rules of their people. He felt a strange gratitude mixed with awe. The attack that had nearly ended his life had also been a lesson, a moment that forced him to confront his limits, his patience, and his understanding of survival. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows over the desert, John felt the first stirrings of hope. He realized that the Apache were not enemies. They were guardians of their land, people who had rules and principles that he did not yet fully understand. They had spared him when they could have easily ended his life. They had provided aid when they could have ignored him. And they were now offering him a chance to learn, to heal, and perhaps, eventually, to move safely through their territory. The night arrived, and this time it was less terrifying than the previous one. John found a shaded spot among the rocks, using the guidance of the Apache to shelter himself from the cold desert wind. He could hear the quiet murmurs of the three figures as they settled nearby. He understood that they were not merely watching, they were guarding, ensuring that he survived another night. It was an extraordinary act, one that forced John to reconsider everything he had thought about strength, survival, and human connection. Lying under the vast desert sky, John felt the pain of his wounds but also a growing sense of understanding. Survival was not about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about patience, observation, and respect for the people and land around you. The Apache had shown him mercy, had observed him carefully, and had offered help when they saw he could endure it. He realized that he owed his life not just to luck, but to their discipline, their wisdom, and their humanity. Throughout the night, John listened to the sounds of the desert, the whisper of the wind, the distant call of an owl, the faint rustle of small animals moving in the rocks. He thought about the lessons he had learned. That courage must be balanced with respect, that fear can teach as much as it can harm, and that survival often depends on understanding the intentions of others as much as on one's own skills. He had faced death and survived, but more importantly, he had begun to understand the fragile and complex connections that allowed life to continue in a harsh and unforgiving world. By the following morning, John felt a cautious confidence returning. His wounds, while still painful, had improved under the care of the herbs and the guidance of the Apache. He knew that he was not yet fully safe, but he had survived the most dangerous part of his ordeal. He had learned that the Apache were not just observers. They were teachers, guardians, and keepers of a knowledge that went beyond survival. He had entered their world as a stranger, weak and wounded, and he was slowly beginning to understand the rules, the patterns, and the lessons they had to offer. In that moment, John realized something profound. Life was not just about endurance or courage. It was about respect, understanding, and connection. The Apache had taught him this lesson without words, through observation, guidance, and cautious interaction. He knew that the days ahead would be challenging, that he would still face danger, uncertainty, and fear. But he also knew that he had begun to learn the principles that could allow him to survive, and perhaps even thrive, in this harsh and beautiful land. And so, as the desert bathed in the golden light of dawn, John prepared himself for the next stage of his journey. He would remain patient, cautious, and respectful. He would observe, learn, and adapt. And he would never forget the woman who had struck him 5 times, nor the 3 Apache who had watched over him. They had given him life, lessons, and a glimpse into a world far larger and more complex than he had ever imagined. And in that understanding lay his greatest hope, that he could continue, survive, and someday tell the story of the desert, the danger, and the extraordinary people who had shown him mercy and wisdom in equal measure. The desert sun rose slowly, painting the rocks and sand in warm shades of gold and amber. John felt the warmth on his face, a stark contrast to the chill of the night before. His wounds were still tender, but he had survived the first crucial days, and his body was beginning to regain some strength. The 3 Apache remained nearby, quietly observing him as he moved. Over the past days, John had learned to interpret their gestures and expressions, and he realized that they were offering him not just survival but guidance. They were teaching him the rules of their land in the simplest, most careful ways. John began to understand that he could no longer act like a stranger wandering into unknown territory. Every movement mattered, every glance was noticed, and every sound could carry meaning. He observed the Apache closely, noting how they moved with precision, their footsteps careful and silent over the rocky ground. He noticed the way they spoke to one another, not with harsh words, but with soft tones, with gestures and nods that seemed to carry more meaning than spoken language could convey. They were living in harmony with the land, attuned to its dangers and its secrets, and John knew that he had much to learn if he was to survive. Slowly, John began to interact more deliberately with the Apache. He mimicked their gestures, showing respect, patience, and careful attention. He pointed to his wounds, then to himself, and made motions indicating that he wanted to learn. The older man, who seemed to act as a leader, observed him closely, then nodded slightly, indicating that John's efforts were recognized. The younger Apache moved closer, offering him water, food, and more herbs. Each small gesture was a sign of trust, a careful acceptance of John into their presence. Over time, John began to communicate more effectively. He used simple gestures and expressions to convey his needs and intentions. The Apache responded in kind, showing him how to treat his wounds, how to find safe spots for shade, and how to move quietly across the desert. John realized that he was being taught not just survival skills but the principles that guided their lives: patience, observation, respect, and understanding. Every action he took was measured, cautious, and respectful, and in return he was slowly gaining their trust. As the day passed, John began to notice more of the Apache routines. They moved with purpose, even in their stillness. They checked the area for danger, prepared simple meals, and communicated silently about what needed to be done. He realized that every action was deliberate, informed by years of experience and a deep understanding of the land. They were teaching him without words, showing him that life in the desert required more than physical strength. It required intelligence, observation, and careful attention to detail. John's gratitude grew with every passing hour. He thought about the woman who had attacked him, and he realized that her actions had not been cruel or unnecessary. She had defended her land and her people, testing John's patience, courage, and understanding. Her attack had been a lesson, harsh but fair, forcing him to confront his limits and to begin learning the ways of the desert. Now, through the guidance of the three Apache, he was learning to survive, heal, and adapt. Each small act of care they offered was a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, understanding and compassion could exist. By late afternoon, John felt confident enough to attempt a short walk. The older Apache gestured for him to follow carefully, pointing out safe paths and areas to avoid. John moved slowly, every step deliberate, his body still weak from the wounds. The younger Apache walked alongside him, guiding him, demonstrating how to move quietly and attentively across the rocky terrain. He realized that the desert was not just a physical challenge, it was a test of patience, awareness, and understanding. Every rock, every shadow, every rustle of the wind carried meaning, and he had to interpret them correctly to survive. During this walk, John began to notice the deeper patterns of life in the desert. He saw where small animals hid, how plants survived in the harsh climate, and how the Apache moved with the land rather than against it. He realized that their survival depended not only on skill and courage, but on observation, respect, and harmony with the environment. They were teaching him a philosophy of life as much as a method of survival, showing him that every choice had consequences, and that patience and careful observation were as valuable as strength. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the desert, John and the Apache returned to the rocky area where he had first been attacked. He felt a sense of accomplishment and relief. The walk had been short but significant. He had learned to trust his guides, to observe carefully, and to act with caution and respect. He realized that survival in the desert required not just endurance but understanding, the ability to read the land, the people, and the dangers around him. That night John prepared for sleep with a new sense of appreciation. The Apache did not just watch him, they ensured he was safe, provided food and water, and guided him in tending his wounds. He felt a growing sense of connection, realizing that these people were not merely strangers. They were teachers, guardians, and guides who had shown him mercy and wisdom. He reflected on the lessons he had learned. Patience, observation, and respect were as important as courage and strength, and understanding the intentions of others could mean the difference between life and death. Throughout the night, John lay quietly, listening to the whispers of the desert. He thought about the journey that had brought him here and the choices he had made. He realized that he had survived not by chance alone, but by paying attention, learning, and respecting the rules of the land. The Apache had tested him, guided him, and allowed him to prove himself worthy of survival. He felt a sense of gratitude, humility, and determination. By the following morning, John felt ready to continue learning from them. He had survived the initial danger, tended his wounds, and begun to understand the principles that guided their lives. The Apache remained near, offering careful observation, guidance, and support. John realized that trust was a fragile thing, earned slowly through patience, respect, and careful action. He had begun to earn that trust, and in doing so, he had also begun to earn a deeper understanding of life in the desert. John spent the day practicing what he had learned. He followed the Apache guidance closely, moving carefully, observing his surroundings and responding to their gestures. He learned to find water in hidden spots, to recognize safe paths, and to use the herbs effectively on his wounds. Each task, each movement, each careful observation strengthened his confidence and his connection to the people who had saved him. He realized that the desert was teaching him not just survival, but the importance of understanding, patience, and harmony. By late afternoon, John felt strong enough to attempt a slightly longer walk, this time exploring further from the rocks. The Apache accompanied him, their presence both protective and instructive. He observed their techniques, their patience, and their attentiveness, realizing that every movement and decision carried meaning. He began to understand the desert not as a hostile place, but as a living environment, full of subtle signals and patterns that could guide his actions. The Apache had shown him that survival was about more than enduring hardship. It was about understanding, respecting, and learning from the world around him. As the day ended, John returned to the camp with a new sense of purpose. He realized that his survival depended not just on his strength or courage, but on his ability to learn, adapt, and understand. The Apache had shown him mercy, guidance, and patience, and he was beginning to see the depth of their wisdom. He had been wounded, tested, and challenged, but he had also begun to learn the true lessons of survival, connection, and respect for the land and its people. That night under the stars, John reflected on the journey so far. He had been attacked, wounded, and left alone in the desert, yet he had survived. He had been tested by the woman who had stabbed him, observed and guided by the 3 Apache, and had learned lessons that went beyond mere survival. Patience, observation, respect, and understanding were now as important to him as courage and strength. He had begun to earn trust, and with it, a new sense of connection to the people and the land around him. John understood that the days ahead would be filled with challenges, but he also knew that he had begun a journey of learning, survival, and understanding. The Apache had shown him that life in the desert was not just about enduring danger, but about observing, learning, and respecting the natural order. He felt a sense of gratitude and determination, knowing that the lessons he was learning would stay with him long after he left this land. The desert morning arrived with a gentle warmth, washing the rocks and sand in soft golden light. John had spent several days learning from the Apache, tending his wounds and observing their ways. He felt stronger now, his body still sore but resilient, his mind sharper and more aware. The lessons he had learned were not just about survival, they were about respect, patience, and understanding, values he had never fully appreciated before. Today, however, he knew that his journey could not remain in this place forever. It was time to move, guided by what he had learned and by the Apache who had saved him. He rose slowly, testing his strength, and the 3 Apache watched him silently, their eyes calm but alert. John knew that this moment required careful attention. The desert could be unforgiving, and one wrong move could still be dangerous. Yet, he felt a strange confidence, born not from arrogance but from the lessons he had internalized. He approached the older Apache, who nodded slightly, acknowledging that John was ready to continue, to take his next steps with awareness and care. John took a moment to look around the rocky terrain that had been both his prison and his classroom. The canyon walls, the scattered stones, and the small patches of resilient desert plants all had taught him something important. He had learned to watch, to anticipate, and to move with intention. Every detail had mattered, from the way shadows shifted in the morning sun to the subtle sounds of wildlife hidden in the rocks. The Apache had shown him that survival was about observation, not force, patience, not recklessness, understanding, not fear. Slowly, John began to walk with the guidance of the Apache. They led him along a careful path through the rocks and sparse vegetation, pointing out areas to avoid and showing him how to move quietly. Each step was deliberate, measured, and careful. John realized that every movement he made reflected his respect for the land and for the people who had allowed him into their world. The lessons he had learned were no longer abstract. They were alive in his actions, guiding him forward. As they walked, John's thoughts returned to the woman who had attacked him. He remembered the shock of the first strike, the pain of the wounds, and the intensity of her gaze. At the time, it had seemed like pure danger, but now he understood it differently. Her attack had been a lesson, a test to ensure he could survive, endure, and respect the rules of her people. She had not sought to kill him without reason. Instead, she had challenged him, and in doing so, had opened the door for him to learn. John felt a sense of gratitude toward her, though he had never met her outside of that moment of violence. The journey through the desert was slow but steady. John's body still bore the marks of his injuries, but his spirit was stronger than ever. He noticed small details he had never seen before. The tracks of small animals in the sand, the way certain plants indicated the presence of water, the subtle shifts in wind that could signal danger or safety. Every observation was a reminder of how deeply the Apache understood their land, and John realized that he had been lucky not only to survive, but to learn from such skilled guides. By midday, they reached a small plateau overlooking the canyon. John paused to rest, his legs heavy but his mind alert. The older Apache gestured for him to sit and offered water and dried food. John accepted carefully, making sure to show gratitude with gestures and respect. As he ate, he reflected on the days that had passed. The Apache had watched, guided, and taught him, transforming his experience from one of fear to one of learning. He had survived an attack, healed his wounds, and gained knowledge that would stay with him for a lifetime. The younger Apache moved around him, showing him small survival techniques, how to find edible plants, how to read the subtle signs of wildlife, and how to move quietly without disturbing the environment. John absorbed every lesson, knowing that each one could mean the difference between life and death in the unforgiving desert. He realized that the Apache guidance was not just about survival. It was about understanding a way of life, a philosophy that valued patience, respect, and harmony with the land. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the desert, the Apache led John to the edge of their territory. The landscape stretched out before him, distant hills, winding canyons, and stretches of desert that seemed endless. John paused, turning to look back at the rocky area where his ordeal had begun. He thought of the woman who had attacked him, the three Apache who had guided him, and the lessons he had learned. He realized that this land, harsh as it was, had given him not only survival but wisdom. The older Apache gestured for John to go, indicating that it was time to continue his journey alone. John nodded, understanding the unspoken instructions. The Apache had guided him, protected him, and taught him, but now he had to take the next steps on his own. He felt a mix of gratitude and solemnity. They had saved his life, and he would never forget the lessons, the care, and the patience they had shown. John began to walk toward the horizon, his steps steady and deliberate. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he carried more than just the memory of survival. He carried knowledge, understanding, and a deep respect for the people who had saved him. Every step was a reminder that life in the desert was about more than endurance. It was about connection, awareness, and respect for the forces, both human and natural, that shaped one's existence. As he walked, John reflected on the courage it had taken to survive the initial attack, the fear he had felt lying wounded on the ground, and the patience required to earn the trust of the Apache. He understood that survival was not simply about being strong or brave. It was about learning, observing, and adapting. The woman who had attacked him had tested him, the Apache had guided him, and now he was moving forward with a new understanding of life, danger, and the delicate balance between the two. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but John no longer felt the same fear he had felt when he first woke to the three Apache watching him. He felt prepared, aware, and respectful. He knew that challenges would continue, that danger could still appear at any moment, but he also knew that he had learned the lessons necessary to survive and adapt. Each rock, each shadow, each gust of wind carried meaning, and he was now equipped to interpret them, guided by the wisdom he had gained. As night approached, John found a small flat area to rest. He built a small fire, careful to keep it controlled and safe. He ate a modest meal, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The Apache guidance had transformed his understanding of survival, and he realized that this experience was more than just a tale of endurance. It was a lesson in life, patience, and respect. He felt a sense of humility and gratitude, knowing that he had been given a second chance and a deeper understanding of the world. Throughout the night, John listened to the desert around him, remembering the lessons of observation, patience, and understanding. He thought of the Apache and the woman who had attacked him, recognizing the wisdom in their actions. They had tested him, guided him, and protected him, all without a word of explanation. He understood now that trust, respect, and careful observation were just as important as courage and strength in ensuring survival. By dawn, John was ready to continue his journey beyond the Apache territory. He rose slowly, tending his wounds and prepared for the next stage of his life. He knew that he would carry the lessons of the desert with him forever, the importance of patience, the power of observation, the necessity of respect, and the value of understanding. These lessons would guide him through future challenges, just as they had guided him through the danger and uncertainty of the desert. As he walked away from the rocky canyon where his life had been nearly ended, John turned once more to look back. The Apache were there, watching silently from the rocks. He nodded, a gesture of deep gratitude and respect. Though words were never exchanged, an understanding passed between them. He would survive not by chance alone, but because he had learned, respected, and adapted. The woman who had attacked him, the three Apache who had guided him, and the desert itself had all contributed to his survival, and he would carry that knowledge forward with him for the rest of his life. John continued his journey, the desert stretching endlessly before him, but he no longer felt fear. He felt awareness, respect, and a renewed sense of purpose. He had been tested, wounded, and challenged, but he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of understanding the world around him. The lessons of the Apache and the desert would remain with him forever, guiding his actions and shaping his life. And so, with careful steps and a mindful heart, John walked into the vast desert, carrying the story of survival, trust, and understanding. He had faced death and pain, been watched and tested, and had learned the importance of patience, observation, and respect. His journey would continue, but he knew that he would never forget the lessons he had learned in the rocky canyon with the woman, the three Apache, and the harsh, unforgiving desert that had tested him so profoundly.